The call came at 2:17 in the morning, and I knew before I even answered it that something had broken open in the world. I had been lying awake anyway, the way I always do now that I am 64 years old and my body has decided that sleep is something that happens to other people. The bedroom was dark and my husband's side of the bed had been empty for 11 years, and the phone lit up on the nightstand with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I thank God every day that I did not. "Ma'am, this is Riverside Memorial calling. We have a young woman here. She was brought in by ambulance about 40 minutes ago. She had your number written on the inside of her wrist." My granddaughter had written my number on her wrist. I drove those 14 miles in 11 minutes. I will not pretend otherwise. She was in the trauma bay when I arrived, and the nurse who met me at the door had kind eyes and a voice that was too careful, the kind of careful that people use when they are trying to keep you from falling apart in a hallway. My granddaughter, my Cassie, 26 years old, who used to fall asleep on my lap watching old movies and who called me every Sunday without fail, was unconscious. She had been found in the parking structure attached to the Whitmore Hotel downtown, slumped against the concrete pillar on level 3, alone, no wallet, no phone. Just my number on her wrist in blue ink, already smearing. The doctor said blunt force trauma to the back of the head. He said it with the same tone people use when they are telling you about the weather. I sat in the chair beside her bed, and I held her hand, and I talked to her the way my own mother used to talk to me when I was sick as a child, low and steady, telling her about nothing in particular, about the garden, about the cardinals that had been coming to the feeder that week, about anything that was soft and familiar and alive. Around 4 in the morning, her fingers tightened on mine. She didn't open her eyes, but she turned her head slightly, and her lips moved, and I leaned in close the way you do, pressing my ear nearly to her mouth. She said 2 words, "Donovan, run." Then she was still again. I sat back in my chair, and I looked at my granddaughter's face, pale and bruised and attached to things that beeped, and something happened inside me that I can only describe as a door closing very quietly. Not slamming, not breaking, just a soft, final click. The part of me that cried and panicked and fell apart stepped back, and the part of me that my mother always called my grandmother's iron came forward. I knew the name Donovan. Cassie had been seeing a young man named Marcus Donovan for almost 2 years. She had brought him to Thanksgiving the previous year, and he had been charming in the way that certain men are charming effortlessly, reflexively, as though it cost him nothing because it meant nothing. He had called me ma'am and complimented my sweet potato casserole and refilled my water glass without being asked, and I had smiled and thanked him and watched him the entire meal. My daughter had whispered to me in the kitchen that I was being too hard on him. I had told her I wasn't being hard on him at all. I was just paying attention. Marcus Donovan was the youngest son of Gerald Donovan. If you live in this part of Virginia, you know that name. Gerald Donovan had been in commercial real estate for 30 years. His company had developed half the waterfront downtown and several of the mixed-use buildings that now stood where old neighborhoods used to be. He sat on the board of 2 hospitals and a university. He had the governor's cell phone number, or so people said. He was the kind of man whose name appeared on buildings and donor plaques and was spoken in certain circles with a particular reverence that had very little to do with admiration and a great deal to do with fear. I drove home at 7 in the morning, showered and changed, and called my sister. My sister Margaret is 68 years old and lives 40 minutes away in the house where we both grew up. She is the kind of woman who has kept every piece of paper she has ever considered important since approximately 1987. She is also the only other person alive who knew what our mother had done. "Maggie," I said when she picked up, "something happened to Cassie." There was a silence. Then, "How bad?" "Bad enough. I need you to find it." Another silence. Longer this time. I could hear her breathing. I could hear the particular quality of that breathing shift the way a person sounds when they have been waiting a long time for something and have finally been told it is here. "You're sure?" she said. She said his name. "All right," Maggie said. "Give me 2 hours. I want to tell you about our mother, because you cannot understand any of what happened without understanding her first. Her name was Ruth, and she cleaned houses for a living for 37 years. She was not ashamed of this. She said that you learned more about people by cleaning their houses than by having dinner with them, and she was right. She cleaned for doctors and lawyers and executives and, Starting in the late 1980s, she cleaned for Gerald Donovan's parents, for Victor and Constance Donovan, in their house on the hill above the reservoir. She cleaned for them for 9 years. Our mother was a quiet woman who noticed everything and said little. She kept a small notebook in the pocket of her house dress, and she wrote things down. Not gossip, not complaints. She wrote down things that troubled her, things she saw and heard that did not sit right. She wrote down dates and times and exact words when she could remember them, and when she could not, she wrote down the sense of them, the weight of them. She had started doing this, she told us once, because of something that happened in the 3rd year she worked for the Donovans. She had overheard a conversation she was not supposed to hear. A conversation between Victor Donovan and another man, in the study with the door half open, about a piece of land that had been condemned and a family that had been paid to disappear and a building inspector who had been persuaded to look the other way. She had written it all down. She had gone home that night and written every word she could remember, and then she had gone back the next day and cleaned the house and said nothing. Because she knew, with the particular knowledge of a woman who had spent her life being invisible to people like the Donovans, that if she said something, she would simply cease to exist. They would make sure of it. So she kept her notebook, and when the notebook was full, she started another one. And when certain conversations led her to documents left carelessly on desks, as people leave things carelessly, when they believe the person cleaning around them cannot read or does not understand or does not matter, she wrote down what she saw, dates, numbers, names. She worked for the Donovans until 2001, when Constance died and Victor moved to a smaller place and no longer needed her. By then, Gerald Donovan was already building his empire, and our mother had 2 full notebooks and a manila envelope of handwritten notes. She put them in a metal lockbox that she kept at the back of her closet, behind her winter coats. She died in 2019. She left the lockbox to Maggie and me with a handwritten note taped to the lid that said only, "You will know when." We had not opened it since. Maggie arrived at my house at 9:30 with the lockbox under her arm and her reading glasses pushed up on her head. We sat at my kitchen table and she set it down between us and we looked at it for a moment without speaking. "Cassie is going to be all right," I said. It was not a question. It was the only thing I could afford to believe. Maggie put her hand over mine. "Then let's make sure it meant something." The notebooks were in better condition than I expected. Our mother's handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of a woman who had learned to write when paper was not wasted. The first entries were from 1989. Reading them felt like hearing her voice again, and I had to stop twice in the first 20 minutes and stand at the window and breathe until I could continue. What was in those notebooks was not nothing. Victor Donovan had, over the course of the years our mother worked for him, been involved in, at minimum, 3 transactions that our mother's careful, non-legal, entirely intuitive documentation suggested were fraudulent. 2 of them involved land. One involved something she described only as the arrangement with the city council, and the details she had written down, names, a dollar amount, a date, were specific enough to be interesting. But what mattered most was not what Victor had done. What mattered was what she had written about Gerald. Our mother had watched Gerald Donovan grow up. She had cleaned his room when he was a teenager. She had, in her quiet and invisible way, watched him become his father. And she had written down, in the careful, measured language she used for everything, what she had seen and heard in the last 4 years she worked in that house. Gerald Donovan, at 22, had been involved in the destruction of a smaller developer's business, a man named Patterson, who had been trying to build affordable housing on a parcel the Donovans wanted. Our mother had heard the phone calls. She had written down the name of the man Gerald had called to make it happen. She had written down the phrase Gerald had used, "make him unable to compete." Mr. Patterson had been audited 3 times in 2 years and lost everything. And there was something else, a name our mother had written and underlined twice, with a date beside it and 4 words after it. "This one will matter." The name was a woman. A young woman who had worked briefly as a receptionist for Donovan Properties in 1999. Our mother had heard her crying in the bathroom of the Donovan house during a party. She had written down what the woman said to her. She had written it down verbatim, the way she wrote down everything that seemed important, and she had tucked a folded piece of paper into the back of the second notebook with the woman's name and a phone number that was now 25 years old. I looked at that folded piece of paper for a long time. Then I called my daughter, who is a paralegal, and I told her I needed two things: a private attorney who handled civil litigation and was not connected to anyone named Donovan, and a way to find a woman I had only a name and an old phone number for. My daughter found the attorney in 4 hours. It took her 3 days to find the woman. Her name was Teresa Holt, and she was 51 years old now and lived in North Carolina. When my daughter called her and said the name Donovan, there was a silence on the phone that lasted long enough that my daughter thought the line had dropped. Then Teresa Holt said, very quietly, "I always thought someone would call eventually." She drove up the following weekend. She sat at my kitchen table, in the same chair where Maggie had sat with the lockbox, and she told me what had happened to her at 24 years old, in 1999, at a company Christmas party on the 14th floor of a building that Gerald Donovan's family owned. She told me with the particular steadiness of a woman who has lived with something for 25 years and made a kind of peace with it, not because it was peaceful but because it was the only way to survive it. She had reported it at the time. She had been told, by a man in a gray suit whose name she had never learned, that she was mistaken about what had happened and that her contract would not be renewed. She had been 24 and alone, and she had gone home, and she had not spoken of it again until she sat in my kitchen. The attorney's name was Sandra Okafor, and she drove down from Richmond on a Tuesday and sat with us for 4 hours. She was 53, small and precise, with the kind of energy that makes you feel like the room has been organized simply by her entering it. She read every page of our mother's notebooks. She read the folded note. She listened to Teresa. She asked questions that were specific and unsparing, and she wrote down the answers in a yellow legal pad without any visible reaction. At the end of the 4 hours, she put her pen down and looked at us. "Your mother was methodical," she said. "I want you to understand that what she did, what she documented, how she documented it is more useful than most of what I receive from professional investigators." "She cleaned houses," Maggie said. "She paid attention," Sandra said. "There's a difference. Half the people I work with pay attention to what they want to see. Your mother wrote down what was there. She told us that some of what was in the notebooks was too old to pursue directly, but some of it was not. And Teresa's account, combined with documentation of a pattern of behavior going back to Gerald Donovan's early career, combined with 3 incidents Sandra was already aware of from her own work in the field, she did not elaborate on this, constituted something she was willing to take forward. "He's connected," I said. Sandra looked at me with an expression that was almost a smile. "So am I," she said. Cassie was discharged from the hospital 11 days after she was admitted. She had a hairline fracture and a concussion and a terror that she wore like a second skin for weeks afterward, flinching at sounds she couldn't identify, needing the lights on at night. She had not been back to the Whitmore Hotel. She had not answered Marcus Donovan's calls, of which there had been 14 in the first week and then none. She sat on my couch one evening in November with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, and she looked at me with the same eyes she had looked at me with when she was 7 years old and had fallen off her bicycle and needed someone to tell her it was going to be all right. "How did you know what to do?" she asked. "I had help," I said. "From someone who did the work a long time ago." "Your mom?" "She always knew this family wasn't what they presented themselves as," I said. "She just waited until the right moment to say so." Cassie was quiet for a while. "He told me I was imagining things," she said. "That I was too sensitive. That I misunderstood what his father meant when he said certain things about where I came from. About what kind of family I was from." She stopped. I started to believe him. "I know," I said. "That's what they count on." What happened over the following 8 months was not fast, and it was not simple, and it was not the kind of thing you see in movies where a single dramatic confrontation in a wood-paneled office resolves everything in 90 minutes. It was depositions and document requests and phone calls from Sandra at 7 in the morning and late nights reading things I didn't fully understand and asking questions until I did. Teresa Holt was not the only woman Sandra found. There was another one, from 2008, who had signed a non-disclosure agreement and had to be very carefully navigated around. There was a former employee of Donovan Properties who had been terminated under circumstances that Sandra described as legally interesting. There was a building contractor from 2014 who had a very specific story about pressure applied at a very specific moment. Our mother's notebooks, which Sandra had now had digitized and authenticated by 2 separate document specialists, provided the connective tissue. Not because they were legal evidence in themselves, they were not, but because they established a pattern. Because they named names that appeared in other documents. Because they contained details that no one who was simply guessing would have known to include. Gerald Donovan's attorneys were very good. I want to be honest about that. They filed motions and objections, and they delayed things, and they made the process expensive and exhausting in the way that wealthy defendants always can. Gerald himself appeared at a charity gala in February and was photographed smiling, and the caption in the society pages called him a pillar of the community, and I read it at my kitchen table with my coffee, and I felt nothing except a steady, unworried calm. Maggie called me that evening and said, "Did you see the paper?" "I saw it," I said. "Does it bother you?" I thought about it honestly. "No," I said. "The photograph is from February. This is going to be resolved in September. There's a difference between what people look like in February and what's true in September." I was off by 3 weeks. It was resolved in early October. I will not go into all the details because some of them are part of a settlement that has conditions attached to it, and Sandra was very clear with me about what I can and cannot say publicly. What I can tell you is this: Gerald Donovan resigned from the boards of both hospitals and the university. Donovan Properties entered into a consent agreement with the State Attorney General's office regarding 3 specific business practices. A civil judgment was entered in Teresa Holt's favor, and the amount of that judgment was not public, but Teresa called me the evening it was finalized, and she cried on the phone, and I cried too, the first time I had cried since the night Cassie was brought into the hospital. Marcus Donovan was not charged with anything. That part is not finished. Sandra has told me to be patient, and patience is something I have had practice with. The part I think about most is not the judgment. It is not the consent agreement, or the board resignations, or any of the formal, documented, legal outcomes. It is something much smaller. About 3 weeks after everything was settled, I drove out to the cemetery where my mother is buried. It was a cold morning, clear and still, and the oak tree near her stone had gone fully gold. I brought her the same thing. I always bring her a bunch of those small orange chrysanthemums she liked, the ones that smell like autumn. I stood there for a while without saying anything, which is how I usually talk to her now. Then I said, "You were right, Mama. We knew when." I drove home thinking about something I had told Cassie a few months earlier, when she was starting to put herself back together and had asked me how I had managed to stay so calm through all of it. She had looked at me like I had some kind of answer she needed. The honest answer is that I didn't feel calm. Not exactly. What I felt was certain. There is a difference. Calm can be performed. Certainty is something you either have or you don't, and I had it because my mother had put it there, not in any grand way, not with a speech or a lesson, but in the years I had watched her move quietly through other people's spaces, watching and writing and waiting, trusting that what was true would eventually matter if someone was willing to do the work to make it matter. People like the Donovans build their power on the assumption that no one is paying attention. That the people who move through their lives, the people who clean and serve and work in the margins of their world are not watching, not understanding, not remembering. They build everything on that assumption. It is the most vulnerable thing about them, and they never see it. My mother saw it. She spent 37 years making herself invisible to people who never considered that invisible people have eyes. I will be honest with you about one more thing. There is a question Cassie asked me that I have not answered yet, not completely. She asked me why, if I had known something was wrong about that family, if I had felt it at Thanksgiving when Marcus sat at my table, I hadn't said something sooner, why I hadn't warned her more directly. I have thought about this a great deal. The honest answer is complicated. The simple version is this: I did not know then what I know now. A feeling is not the same as knowledge. A feeling is not something you take to an attorney or present to anyone as evidence of anything. All I had at Thanksgiving was the instinct of a woman who has been paying attention for 64 years, watching a young man refill water glasses with the particular attentiveness of someone performing a role. That is not enough. What changed was Cassie's voice in a hospital room at 4 a.m, and a name she managed to say with what little she had left, and the fact that our mother had known, long before any of us, that the Donovans were not what they appeared to be, and had loved us enough to do something about it before she even knew she needed to. That is the version I sit with. It is not entirely comfortable, and I have decided that is appropriate. The things we need to carry should have some weight to them. Sandra Okafor and I had coffee last month. She told me she is working on 2 other cases with similar elements, patterns of behavior, paper trails, people who had been made to feel invisible deciding they were not. She asked if she could reference our case, without identifying details, in some materials she was preparing. I told her yes. She asked if there was anything I wished I had done differently. I thought about it for a while. I thought about Cassie in the trauma bay, and Teresa crying on the phone, and my mother's small, careful handwriting filling up 2 notebooks over 9 years of watching and saying nothing and waiting. I wish I had opened that lockbox sooner, I said. But I also think my mother was right. There's a time for everything, and acting before the time is right doesn't make things faster. It just makes them messier. Sandra nodded like she had heard something like this before. She sounds like someone I would have liked, she said. She was very quiet, I said. You wouldn't have noticed her if you met her somewhere. That was the whole point. She was the kind of person who people forgot was in the room. I paused. That's a very powerful thing to be, I said, if you use it right. Cassie is doing well now. She moved into a new apartment in the spring, on the 3rd floor of a building with good locks and a doorman she likes. She got a promotion at work that she absolutely deserved and had been waiting 2 years for. She calls me every Sunday still, without fail. Last week she called on a Saturday, which she almost never does, and when I answered she said, I just wanted to tell you something. I said, all right. She said, I've been thinking about Great-Grandma Ruth a lot lately. I've been thinking about what she did, and I think I want to do something like that. Not exactly that, but something where I'm paying attention to things that matter, where what I notice means something. I didn't say anything for a moment. Outside my window, the cardinals were at the feeder again, 2 of them, the way they've been coming all fall. Your great-grandmother would have liked hearing that, I said. Do you think she knew? Cassie asked. That it would come to this? I thought about my mother moving through that house on the hill above the reservoir, quiet and careful, writing down things in a small notebook that no one ever looked at, trusting that the truth was worth the trouble of recording even when it seemed like it would never matter to anyone. Yes, I said. I think she knew exactly.